I think it's important to talk about it all the time. The culture that you're talking about is that we're really clear that we cannot do church without volunteers.
Well, hey everyone, welcome to the Intentional Churches podcast. My name is Erin Johnston, and I'm here with a couple friends. I've got my friend Jill and Doug Parks. Doug, I think most of our listeners know who you are, so we'll start with you. How are you, Doug?
Erin, it's still hot. We are very hot still in Vegas, but I see cooling on the horizon. It will be Never in my life did I think I would say, oh, it's only going to be 100 and think that's awesome.
Yeah, you know you're from the Southwest when, ...
Right.
We're also here with Jill. Jill, would you just introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're at, all that.
Okay. Well, hey, everybody. I'm from the Midwest. Actually, I'm very proud of that. From Central Illinois. I grew up on a pig farm. A lot of people are usually surprised by that. But I'm out here in Orange County, California. And I've been at Eastside Christian Church now for 15 years, actually. And so came out to be the weekend experience person overseeing worship, production, communications, guest services for a while. And just kind of getting us all working together was really one of my main focuses. But we knew we wanted to go multi-site. And so I had my eyes set on that. And so we developed a role for me to do that. And so we have gone from one campus to 7 campuses pretty rapidly. And so multi-site, and then I'm on the executive team still. And so projects, anything special that comes up gets to land in my lap. So we're actually just getting ready to wrap up our 2-year initiative with Generis and raising some funds to continue to open more campuses. And I've been a part of that as well. So it's kept me busy.
Wow. All right. Well, great to have you with us. Thanks for jumping on. Pig farm. That I was not expecting you to say that. So love it.
Well,
random fun facts.
Yes.
That's great. Well, we are in season 4 of the Intentional Churches podcast. And in this season, we're really talking about preparing for the next push, whatever that might be, wherever you fall in the calendar year. You know, ministry kind of ebbs and flows, and there's seasons when there's extra like strategic effort and a push, typically like in fall and springtime or around holidays or however your church thinks about it. So we're just trying to help have conversations with different church leaders about preparing for the next push in different areas of our churches and of our ministries. And so this episode, we thought we'd talk about everybody's favorite topic, which is volunteers. How do we think about recruiting and caring for the next volunteers in our churches? Especially as we think about whatever the next push might be, we are always needing to recruit and care for volunteers. And so I thought maybe we could start with maybe a little bit of looking back at volunteers from your perspective and your context. Let's go back to 2020. What? Oh, I know.
I knew it.
The buzzword. What has changed as you look at the scope of like recruiting and caring for volunteers from 2020 to now? What has changed? What have you noticed? What have you observed over that period of time?
Yeah, for sure. We have to talk about COVID, unfortunately, because it did change things. And volunteering somewhat runs parallel with attendance. I mean, some of that's obvious because you do the math. You got to have people attending in order to get volunteers. And so what COVID did is it created what we kind of call a hybrid model of attendance. Some people call it dual citizenship. So people discovered that, hey, I can do church online and I'm still going to church. I still feel connected somehow. I'm growing in my spiritual journey. And then when, I can, I'll go physically to church. And so that's something that we've had to embrace, is just to say, that's our reality. So therefore, our volunteers fall into that too. So that's one of the things coming back from COVID and trying to, get things back in line and grow and so forth guess what? People aren't going to volunteer every week anymore either. So that was pretty significant for sure.
We saw out, with intentional churches, we were with a lot of churches in late 20 and 21. that the residual of longtime volunteers, people who may have helped in the nursery or whatever for a long time, either left our churches because they weren't happy with our politics or whatever, the way we talked about politics, or decided this was a chance for me to do something different. So the trend across America was that volunteerism was cratered in a lot of churches as they came back to live attendance because of what Jill's talking about. But then also this, it gave people a chance to take a break,
Another thing is that people moved. We had a lot of people move out of California.
Yeah, no, they all came here.
That's right. Yeah. No, I appreciate that you said the word embrace, because I think I hear, it can be easy to just be ticked that people aren't coming back physically, that they're only going online. But I love that you use the word where you just have to embrace the reality that this is church today. And so how are we gonna work at that? Where do you guys find yourselves right now? So that's been the journey since 2020. Like, let's get to present day. Like, how are you thinking about recruitment and training and retention and all those things? I mean, there could be a podcast episode on each one of those topics, but just give us an overview. Like, how are you thinking about volunteers now this year at this time in your churches, in the season your church is in?
Yeah. So one of the things we just did recently is we kind of adjusted some staff roles, and we got the person that had been our volunteer champ across all of our campuses. We got that role to full-time, just committed to volunteering, overseeing all of our volunteers. Now that doesn't mean, every volunteer reports to them, but this role brings consistency across all of our campuses and in every area. So even like creative arts to campus operations, the cafe, kids, all that. So this role holds the bar, holds the branding, the training, all the, behind the scenes stuff, the background checks, upholding all that by leading through our volunteer champs that are in all the different areas. And so our volunteer champs, which are typically administrators or, admin roles within a ministry or a campus. And so this role can, follow up, check the data. We use Rock. We're developing more and more in Rock, how we can track the process. So our goal is always, if someone reaches out to volunteer, if it doesn't work where they thought they wanted to serve, we make sure they have a good handoff to an area that they might serve in. And so this role oversees that. Hey, what's our retention? What's our placement? And so we also kind of celebrate that. We just had a ministry team meeting, and they celebrated like the ministry that placed the most volunteers. And they made some other fun, awards and things like that for that. So it's all tracked and watched. But because of this role, we're going to take it to a new level.
I'm interested, Jill, just for our listeners, I'm listening to you talk about things that I don't see in a lot of churches, especially smaller churches. But I think for some of our listeners who may be in a church that's 100 or 200 could embrace some of the strategies you just ticked off. So tell us about a little more detail on the role you just went to full time. Like, what was the genesis? So how did that begin? And then the champions are more, you said, administrative. So just a little more detail on that, I think, would be helpful for our listeners.
Yeah, I think we learned from a lot of other churches. I know that we were, meeting and researching and having conversations. What are you doing? What could we adjust? So I think consistency is the main thing we kept seeing. Like, and I don't mean to pick on creative arts. I used to lead creative arts, but generally,
pick on them. Let's do it.
And they actually just won the award for like the most placed in the fastest amount of time.
Nice.
And everybody in the room was like, "What? Are you sure? Let's check that data." So anyway, but yeah, consistency, because you find is no matter what size church, you find that one area is doing this and one's doing that, and maybe we're not doing some of the legal stuff we got to do because you're serving with kids, and leaders come and go, whether they're volunteer or staff, and so again, no matter what size the church, if the leadership changes of an area, the nursery or whatever it is, then sometimes the guidelines, and those things can change. And someone's, well, I don't think that's so important. So somebody has to kind of hold everybody accountable. Then you asked me about the admin or volunteer champs. So those are people that in a ministry, they're overseeing. So this is, it's a matrix organization. So they don't necessarily have supervisor roles over staff or even volunteers, but they have to uphold that the process is happening and things, and they're going into rock and they're placing people and making a profile and tracking in there. So that's what that role is. It's part of their role. They have other things to do. But.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. Thanks for clarifying that. I'm curious as we think about generationally about volunteering. We obviously millennials are at prime age to be serving, but even Gen Z is now stepping in and serving in different roles. What are you noticing about those generations in volunteering? How are you seeing those generations express themselves in volunteering? Just talk to me about what you're observing about those generations.
Yeah, a couple of things I was thinking about on that question. Well, we'll go to the minors first. So, so Gen Z, I think they're growing out of this, but they're still under 18, quite a few of them, right? And, that's what we want to do is we want to get our kids, our students used to serving at a young age so that they continue to do that as they get out of high school and are looking to do what they want to do, or maybe they're going to go to college, but then come back, that kind of thing. So to instill the importance of, volunteering, we want to start as young as we can. What that brings, though, is, a minor serving in an area with adults. So there's things that have to get put in place for that, right? We're doing a big push right now for high school students to serve in our kids ministry. Here's something that came up for us. We have a room called our Changemaker room. We call our volunteers Changemakers. And it's a place where they can go get some chips and some water and, just kind of get refreshed. Any Changemaker can go in there. Well, not every volunteer is going to be screened. So if you're serving in the parking lot, you don't have to be screened. If you're going to serve with minors, you have to be screened. So now you've got this melting pot of people. And so just recently we had to say, okay, our high schoolers serving in kids ministry can't go into this room by themselves. And that was a big deal. And it's ruffled some feathers, but we're working through it because we have said to our staff, it's too important. We cannot have a story of a situation because we didn't do that. But it's worth it because we're also seeing high schoolers really start to volunteer. Now, one of the things that's happening is our high school leaders, our two staff people, they're intentionally asking students, come meet me on a Sunday, meet me at this time. I'm going to walk you into the kids ministry, show you what it could be like. And so that's really helping. We're seeing the growth there.
That's great.
Millennials. Millennials or millennials? Okay, so young adults.
Careful, Erin's a millennial.
Whoa.
No, I mean, here's what I laugh. I've been doing this, unfortunately, long enough to say young adults tend to have some of the same things going on as every young adult, no matter what the generation's called. There's some differences because technology changes, the world changes. I get that. But of course, young adults generally have more time, right? They haven't quite gotten into that phase of their life where, maybe they're not married yet, don't have kids, that kind of thing. So they're ready to serve. And I think the church has to grab onto that every new generation. So it probably matters what the church is doing for young adults during the week. So think about a midweek gathering. We happen to have a midweek gathering for young adults. That it's great because there's connectivity there, and it's very close to where young adults are at in their season of life. But what can do is pull away from serving on the weekends because they already had their church midweek. And so that's been a constant thing. We've gotten better at it and we've gotten worse at it right now. We're not doing so good with it. So we're really talking to our young adult leader and saying, we don't measure your success by your Wednesday night attendance. We're measuring your success by young adults involved in the weekend services and in small groups. So that's attention for us that we have to pay attention to pretty often to get millennials serving on the weekend.
I want to see if you guys, you all would agree or disagree with this. I think one of the things I'm noticing is that the boomer generation and Gen Xers, which we're now called the survivors. Isn't that funny that we're called the survivors?
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So everybody wants, once you're engaged in church, you want to have impact. Like you want to help people and you want to be better. So it doesn't really matter generationally. But I think boomers and Gen Xers, especially boomers, were more motivated by responsibility, duty, contribution to the organization, maybe. And I am seeing with the millennials and Gen Z, this is a nuanced difference, but the motivation seems to be a lot more about personal contribution inside of this impact. I want to bring something and contribute from who I am, who God made me to be. So I just wondered, do you guys agree, disagree? Do you see that kind of difference emerging? Because if it is true, then I think recruitment and retention strategies have to shift a little bit from, for boomers, a lot of times you could get up and say, we need you. The organized church needs you to man up and do a spot, whereas millennials and Gen Z may not respond so much to that kind of deal. So anyway, any thoughts around that?
I mean, I think that's true to an extent. The church needs you, I think, is less appealing in terms of, like you were saying, Doug, responsibility to step into something that way more attracts the older generation. There's a need, let's fill it. Whereas the younger generation, my generation, is like, yeah, I want to be part of something bigger than myself. And I want to know the unique thing that I bring to the table. And where does my greatest gift meet your greatest need? Like, do those things collide? There's a leader that's leading like lots of Gen Z, trying to help Gen Z like get involved in culture and in the church and stuff. And the question that organization always asks is like, what was the wrong you were born to make right? And I think that is how Gen Z and millennials are thinking about serving the church. They want to take a wrong and make it right. They want to bring something from the center of who they are, not just fill a spot. So I think you're onto something, Doug. I don't know, Jill, what would you add to that?
I'm learning from this conversation, actually. So that's interesting. My gears were just going on, okay, what am I going to do with that information? Because that's good. I'm not sure I've heard that conversation before. So yeah, I learned something.
Well, I would love to spend the last few minutes of our conversation flipping into maybe just, a word about creating volunteer culture. You've talked about the need for consistency across the board, which I really appreciate. That's something we have struggled with. Is every team has a different process and a different plan and it's all different. You could have an entirely different experience from one team to the next. And so that's something we're working on. And I'm sure many of our listeners can relate to. No matter the size of your church, it doesn't matter. People can have different experiences altogether, even culturally, of serving. And so let's talk about volunteer culture for a minute. How do you think about creating, establishing, perpetuating the kind of volunteer culture that you hope everybody experiences that serves at your church?
Yeah, that's good. I think it's important to talk about it all the time. Not like we need you, we're struggling, not just like even in encouraging ways. I think back to like when a campus starts up. So this could pertain to a smaller church as well, but because our campuses for us start really small, like 100 people, small. So we tell the campus pastor in that first year, while you have a script and we have our franchise model and all that, when you're in your first year, you need to celebrate the volunteers from the stage. Celebrate and say, hey, we're so thankful. Who here's, who's been volunteering, and raise their hand and say, okay, say thank you. And then that's a chance to say, and, we'd love for others to get involved. So that's just some language we do in our early years of launching a campus, I think it's interesting. Sorry, my mind's kind of going in a different, because we're such like I said, we have really small campuses, and then we have, of course, our broadcast campus is large. And so we're going through some of that, like, how do you celebrate and create a culture for our campuses that are running, 300-400, and then we've got a campus that's running, 6,000 or 7,000. And so that's a lot of conversation for us as we're doing ministry planning. Like, when do we want to celebrate all the volunteers on every campus all at once? And what does that look like? And how should we maximize campuses that are of a size that it looks different to celebrate the volunteers? What do you give them all a gift? Okay, well, that adds up to a lot of money, even if you spend very little. Do you do something with a weekend series? And so really make it a big deal. So we do all those things depending on where we're at. So looking at the numbers and saying, how are we doing? Is this an area that we want to transfer some resources to? But I think the culture that you're talking about is that we're really clear that we cannot do church without volunteers. Volunteers are leading. We just got to celebrate. We have a volunteer that completely leads a medical team to go over to Kenya and serve. So little by little, as the volunteers were going on serve trips, going on global trips, and they were starting to show some capacity and some ability to lead, we now have several that are we have a dental team that's led by a volunteer, a dentist, and they've learned the process and they know how to set it all up, and they have the connections to our people in these countries. And so that's like huge. So I guess we have a pretty good culture now that I say that out loud. I mean, that they feel like, but it has to come from the leadership in each of those ministries. And then, of course, also just big picture. Everybody knows how much we cherish and love our volunteers, and we just try to talk about that.
Doug, what would you say from the national perspective? What are you noticing? Is there anything like really interesting that you've seen about how people are thinking about creating volunteer culture, or anything that you personally have done yourself?
Well, we've already hit on it a little bit, but this is super important to going forward. Traditionally, I called it, most churches have a siloed volunteer strategy, meaning it's just different experiences and different cultures depending upon the ministry. And volunteerism, serving, oftentimes spirals down into filling the slots in the machine of ministry to get things done, instead of seeing it as part of Great Commission expression, as somebody becoming a disciple of Jesus. And so I think in this newer trend that Jill is referencing, the consistency is going to have to be there to answer both of these questions of like, how do we make sure that volunteering and serving is part of someone becoming a disciple maker of Jesus, not just a worker bee? And I don't know how you get there without getting the consistency that Jill's talking about. So if I were a church leader listening, I would really be thinking about, hey, even if I'm in a small church, how do I get a volunteer champion like what Jill was talking about, who is bringing that consistency across the ministries? So I think that's the trend going forward. And I also think, back to our earlier conversation, that is going to help recruit and retain more and more of the younger generation if we have that viewpoint, as opposed to, I know as I led in church, there were many times where it was just, we got to get the slots filled so the room can be open, the least common denominator, and maybe safe. Can the kids' room be open first? Safety second, kind of like, you don't want to have that mentality, but that is
so real though.
I know.
Yeah. That's helpful. I think for us in our context, we think about creating volunteer culture, like every moment we think about being intentional, and so we do a volunteer orientation that we require for anybody before they serve. It's something newer we've started. We do that every month so people can jump in all the time. And the point of that orientation is really to orient people not to what to expect when they get to their team or any of that sort of thing, but like the why. So we point people to scripture. We point them to values. We point them to this is why we serve. And just so that everybody has that baseline understanding before they just show up to the kids ministry classroom or the student ministry small group or even our door holders or whatever. That's been a really important piece for us. And to describe how volunteering is part of being a disciple and making other disciples. And so for us, the orientation time is really important. It's less than an hour long. It just helps, orient people and helps them kind of find their next step in terms of volunteering. And then we are asking every single one of our teams, our volunteer teams, to do a short circle up with their teams before they start. And for that to not just be an information dump or detail dump, but to be an intentional moment of training, connection, and reminding people back to scripture. This is an expression of being a disciple and making disciples. And so like those value add moments, I think are really important. And every single moment you get to exactly like you're both saying, like, this isn't just something you do because we need you to do it, but this is part of your formation. Like we are formed as we serve. So
love it.
It's really helpful. Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah.
As we kind of round the corner into the end of this conversation, Doug, you already kind of gave one thing based off what Jill had said for our listeners to think about, which is, like how do you create consistency? Like that should be a first step, is raising up a volunteer champion, even if that person themselves is a volunteer. If you're in a church small enough that can't afford a staff member, that's okay. But Jill, I'm wondering from you, is there anything else you would tell our listeners as you think about training, recruitment, and even creating volunteer culture? Like we always love to offer just a few practical next steps. Is there anything you would offer our listeners as just like, try this or think about this or don't forget this?
Yeah, for sure. I would say don't stop. Like don't get to a point in an area and go, okay, we're good. We filled all the slots. Like recruiting has to continue all the time because life changes. People move. People have a family member that needs their attention. And so they have to pull out. And sometimes, they're like really good volunteers, but life has changed and they have to pay attention to that. They have to. So I've just always told people over the years, don't ever stop, always be on the lookout, lean into like your best volunteers to do recruiting for you. Don't ask everybody, hey, bring a friend, because you might have a volunteer they're doing okay, but you wouldn't necessarily want them to be bringing more people in, but you have some that are like magnetic and they totally get it. The other thing, so on the like continuing to recruit you don't want to burn people out from hearing it, especially from the platform, the stage, right? So in our ministry planning, we're very strategic about when we're going to really hit volunteer recruitment from the stage. And it's not just going to be an announcement, it's going to be part of a bigger thing. And that's always been our most impact, is when maybe we even have a 3-week series on what you were talking about, Erin. Just we were created to do this and really unpack that. And then I will say, be careful when you get ready to do that. Make sure you're 100% ready to go, because people will hear that. They will hear the pastor call and they will say, okay, sign me up. Are we ready to receive their sign up? And so this last time that we did it, it was me. I talked to the whole staff and I said, create the space in your team's weeks coming up after this. It's not an add-on. Pull stuff out, create the space, because Jean was going to stand from the stage and say, you will get a phone call in 48 hours. It was something like that. We've done different things. If we're going to say that, we better be able to do it. And I learned that a long time ago as a lot younger person in ministry. And, you get a stack of cards back in the day and you're not ready to follow through, then you're going to lose them, right? They're out. So that's an important thing. If somebody gets a call like they're supposed to and they're getting taken care of through the process, then it's going to work. And then lastly, most churches, I should say, have something like a first step, next step, membership class, whatever it's called. And so volunteering is part of that for us. And we've evolved ours before. We have that 7-week thing. We had a 4-week thing. We now just have a once a month thing, where that's where you can come learn more about the church and how to get connected. And we decided that becoming a volunteer was going to be one of like the 2 main focuses. And so then we used to do tours, behind the scenes tours right then and there during services so they could see. But now they get to go and meet with somebody from that department. So even our campus operations, this really warms my heart because I lead campus operations now. They get to go out and talk to some of our campus operations people and learn what it'd be like to volunteer as a campus ops person. And we've seen some results that we would never have seen in the past because they got to meet somebody face to face and learn about it.
So good. I just don't think we can like undervalue the real life connection. Like an immediate touch with a real person, just changes things. Well, this conversation's been really helpful, Jill. Thanks for sharing just some of your insight with us. Doug, as usual, thanks for sharing some of your national perspective. Doug's always bringing the generational perspective. Captain Gen X himself.
Sit in between for a few more years.
That's right. Yep. Well, to our listeners, I hope that you will take some of what you've heard today and just reflect on your current recruiting and training and even volunteer culture. And what's one next step you could take in working towards some consistency? And like Jill said, just don't stop. Continue to create space all the time so that more and more people might be able to find their place in our churches, serving alongside other great people. So thanks to our listeners. Thanks, Jill and Doug. Thanks for listening to the Intentional Churches podcast.